All right, welcome back to us. This is the podcast, A Lesson Before Writing, episode 4. I'm Ted Morrissey, and I'm here with my co-hosts, Brady Harrison, and this is Brady's most recent book that 12 Winters Press has published, The Term Between. And we'll be talking more about this in just a second. And then also here with Grant Tracy, and this is the most recent book by Grant that we've published, Five Hard Bites, a collection of Hayden Fuller novels and a novella and a story. And we'll be talking more about this in just a minute too, probably. While I am dominating the screen, though, I will mention that just a few books from 12 Winters. My book, Delta of Cassiopeia, which is a collection of stories and sonnets, is now out in paperback. It came out in January in hardcover, but it's now out in paperback, so I wanted to push that a little bit. I did mention this last episode, but our another very new release is Jennifer Gravely's The Story I Told My Mother, and I know she's been giving some readings locally and so forth, and is having a really good time, sharing her work with people. I mean, it's a very serious book, poems and an essay, but I know Jen has really, enjoyed connecting with people via the book and so forth. So that's terrific. Earlier this summer, we published John Paul Jaramillo's Carlos Montoya, sorry, I went foreign there for a second, is in hardcover, but we're working on a paperback edition. So kind of watch for the paperback in the next few weeks, hopefully. And then this is a little bit older publication, but I'm so proud of it. I wanted to kind of give it a shout out again. And this is Trees Grow Lively on Snowy Fields. And it's a collection of the work of 12 Chinese poets and then 5 translators who render them into English. And it was really a challenging book to publish because it's a bilingual edition with Mandarin and English with the facing pages, and the lines line up exactly. And I'll tell you, the book designer really worked hard on this because he does not know Mandarin. I'm the book designer, by the way. And so this was really a difficult project, but I really love that we got it out. And so Trees Grow Lively on Snowy Fields. Right. So if you've watched our podcast before, we kind of talk about writing related stuff. And then at the last part of the podcast, we'll have a featured story that we'll talk about. So that's coming up here. But wanted to get back just for a couple minutes to Brady's The Term Between, because it just recently, like last week, won the why can I never think of the name? Brady, help me out, Brady. Tell me about your award. I'm sorry to go thorn on you.
Oh, well, thank you, Ted. And I apologize for how gruff I sound. Yeah, I had the great good fortune to win a book award, and then immediately caught a cold. So that's that's how things roll with me. So yes, The Term Between won the High Plains Book Award for short stories just this past weekend, and it was a great surprise, and such a fun weekend, and got to meet so many great folks. And the High Plains Book Awards draws submissions, considers works from uh, both sides of the 49th. And so there were a number of Canadian writers that won prizes, and a number of American writers. And so it's the Western Plains, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, the Dakotas, uh, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and Colorado. So it was, yeah, it was very exciting. And when before the awards, or just as the awards ceremony was beginning, uh, the chair who was introducing folks who would award the prizes mentioned that the winners would have to say something, which totally contravenes my ethos of never being noticed, of never going to the front of the room. So it was only modestly terrifying, but yeah, wonderful folks. And so my thanks to the High Plains Book Awards, community of readers, community of judges, and my thanks as always to Ted. I don't want to get all sentimental, but thanks to Ted and 12 Winters for publishing the book.
All right, that's well. You're welcome. Thanks for trusting me in 12 Winters with it. So that's fantastic. Yeah, you mentioned something that is one of those sort of conundrums or something in terms of the publishing world, is that most writers are introverts. I mean, it just makes sense. I mean, you enjoy spending your time, by yourself, generally speaking, writing and so forth. But then when a book comes out, you know, it'd be nice if we all had like a little bit of P.T. Barnum in us, to promote the book. And I run into that with writers that, they want to publish their books. I'm not criticizing anybody, just to be clear, but it's a much hard for a lot of writers. It's much harder to promote themselves than it is to write an 800-page epic. I mean, it just isn't part of their personality. And so I think and it's true. It's true for across the board. I mean, obviously, we can all think of a handful of writers, in history who were obviously adept at self-promotion, but most writers, are much more comfortable out of the limelight, which then of course makes it harder to kind of get the word out to the broader reading world. But anyway, congratulations again. It's well deserved, and it's just terrific that all came to pass here. So that's great. As I've mentioned before, we've got your first novel we're working on getting out hopefully in early 2024, and then I mentioned we'd come back to Grant's Five Hard Bites. Just very quickly, one of the novels in here, yep, there it is the novel Neon Kiss, and my original plan was to bring Neon Kiss out, which is a Hayden Fuller novel by itself, and then we were going to do this omnibus anthology with the 3 novels, the novella and short story. But I don't know, life just got away from me in the pandemic and yada, yada, yada. So we never brought out Neon Kiss as a standalone book. And I've always felt bad about that, quite honestly, because it's such a great book. And I feel like it kind of got buried in the middle of this collection, which is a great collection, by the way. So anyway, we're in the process of bringing out like a special edition of Neon Kiss. And Grant has written a brand new introduction for it, which doesn't so much talk about the novel specifically and the Hayden Fuller mystery specifically, but more kind of the history of detective fiction and why it's important and that kind of thing. So, and it's a terrific introduction. Grant fired it off in very little time. So I don't know, Grant, would you want to say a word or two maybe about, you don't have to give away too much about the intro if you don't want, but just say a word or two, if you would, about bringing out Neon Kiss by itself and maybe the writing of that introduction a little bit.
Yeah. I'm super excited, Ted. And so thanks. It's probably the favorite novel I've written. So I'm pleased that it's going to get a standalone moment. I really like A Shoe Shine Kill, but somehow Neon Kiss, I don't know what I was channeling. It was kind of like, it was something special. So I appreciate that. And the intro, it was just, it didn't take me long to write because I've been thinking about this stuff for years, but I talked mainly about in crime noir, how nothing is what it seems, and the reader is placed in uncertainty, and that's one of the joys of the genre. We can't trust anything. Whereas you read something else by an accomplished literary writer, and we believe in the sensibilities, unless they're doing an unreliable narrator. We believe in the sensibilities, but in crime noir, every time a character meets another character, we're like, okay, what are they hiding? What are they lying about? And I think that's one of the things I enjoy so much about the genre, is having to dig into those subtexts over and over again. So that's kind of what I explore in the introduction.
Yeah, and it's a great introduction. Of course, I'm obviously biased, but yeah, we're working on that. Obviously, we already had the novel typeset, so it's not quite as as big of a not quite as labor intensive to get this book out, because we already basically have published it before. We're just bringing it out in different format. But we've got the new introduction, and then what's really fascinating, or among the fascinating things about the Hayden Fuller mysteries, is they actually all line up on a chronology. So Hayden's timeline. So in the Five Hard Bites, we've published a Hayden Fuller timeline where you've plotted like where all these different stories and novels, novellas happen, and you've updated that because since Five Hard Bites, you've published several new stories, and now you have the new book coming out next year, A Shoe Shine Kill, which you've plotted onto that as well. So let me just talk to you about that for a second. Is that thinking of Hayden as having a very definite chronology, is that a help to your writing the series, or does that sometimes kind of paint you into a corner where you wish maybe you hadn't committed the fact that Hayden had done X, Y, or Z at a certain time?
That's interesting. I don't really feel painted into a corner, but you do get kind of caught in the thing like with the Marvel universe back in the day. Now you can do whatever you want in comic books. You know, you don't have to be consistent. But back in the day, they used to give no prizes to people that would find inconsistencies across the Marvel universe plot line. But I do know, like in one of the early novels, I gave Hayden a sister, and then I later decided not to have the sister. So when we brought out Five Hard Bites, we removed a sentence that mentions a sister because there is no sister. So things like that. But no, it's just, to me, it's exciting because I don't need to keep it linear. Like the next book is 5 years. It's 1972, the Canada Russia series or Soviet Union, and it's the first 4 games that I cover. And Hayden's watching it, and so the plot takes place during that time. And who knows, maybe I'm actually thinking the next novel is going to be set in 1969, so I'm going to go backwards and forwards in time instead of always forward, because I grew up watching WKBW out of Buffalo, New York, across the lake from Toronto, and I want to do a story about. I've had a few people, including Adam Boltz, who is a good he's read all my stuff, so shout out to him. But he said you got to do a novel with Eddie Sands and Hayden together, so that's what I'm going to do, and it's going to be set in Buffalo. And I'm going to talk to my buddy Craig Fisher and find some places to go and go check it out. But it's going to be it's set around a TV station that I grew up watching, and all these personalities and a murder and a missing woman and all that kind of stuff. So that's the next project. So I'm excited about that. And I got that idea from Max Allan Collins, because in his Quarry novels, he jumps around in time. He'll have something set in the Watergate era, then he'll do something set in the 80s, and he doesn't feel like he needs to keep it linear. And I guess I'm moving in that direction of wanting to be a little more flexible.
Well, and that was one of the reasons why I encouraged you to do that timeline, because I think readers of the series, it's helpful to have a sense of chronology, and they can just go to that,
Right.
and see exactly where things happen according to when or whatever. So that's fantastic. And like I said, we're working on getting that out very soon, and then both your new books, are on the publishing schedule for 2024. So I'm super excited about that as well. So this is supposed to be our Halloween themed issue. In fact, I'm wearing my Crows Have Eyes t-shirt. Yeah, well, there you go. Creature in the Black Lagoon. I know Grant always has cool t-shirts. I usually don't. I got this out from my Schitt's Creek, days. And but anyway, this is our kind of Halloween edition. And so what that means to me, among other things, is that I think we want to talk maybe a little about Gothic literature and just anything that kind of comes to mind. And that's another reason why the featured story that we're doing later is published by Nervous Ghost Press. So that also is part of the theme here. Before we get into all that specifically, I wanted to go back to Brady for a second, because you had told us you were working on ghost stories when you left Ireland, where you had done a guest professorship or whatever the right word for it is for a year. Are you still writing ghost stories, or how's all that going?
Well, yeah. So I am working, and I think it's actually going to be at this point, I believe it has become a ghost novel. But I was so delighted when we began talking um, about doing this Halloween, the fall themed podcast today, because I love ghost stories, and I love reading, and I have close to hand all the time anthologies for this time of year to read these stories. And so I've been thinking a lot about ghost stories and the different kinds of genres of ghost stories. And so I don't know if this will be of interest to our viewers or to both of you, but I love sort of classic Gothic frightening ghost stories, but I also really like Spoon River anthology, the Edgar Lee Masters, Illinois connection for us. And so that's a different kind of ghost story, that kind of chattering, in the grave. And so I've been working on both kinds of ghost stories, the things that go bump and also kind of more sedate, more cerebral, perhaps, Spoon River anthology type. And I'll stop rattling on here in a second. But one of the really fun things about ghost stories and about supernatural stories is you have to figure out the rules. What are the rules for your creature? And so, of course, we're all familiar with vampire books and stories and movies. And so each diegesis has a slightly different set of rules for how the vampires operate. What things will constrain them, or what things will destroy them? What things can they do? Can they go out in the sunlight? Are they day walkers? Do they mine garlic? Do they mine silver? And so, Grant, we've been talking about werewolf movies too. What are the rules? And that's really, as a writer or writing those kinds of stories, that's been a really just absolutely delightful part. What are the rules that govern the creatures that you're trying to create, and the kind of scares or frights or discomforts you're trying to call into being in the reader?
Yeah, I think there's a Paul Nash. I got into Paul Naschy. He's an international movie guy. He does all these werewolf movies in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he did it interesting, because it's always like, how do you resurrect the werewolf? Like, they're always coming back alive, And,
I thought we got that guy.
I know. And one of them, I hope I have this right, because sometimes I conflate things and mix it up with my own imagination. But in one of the werewolf movies, because I watched a whole bunch of them in a row, his body is dug up and some jackass removes a silver bullet from him. Not a good idea. As soon as the silver bullet is removed, he turns into a wolf and he's back doing his thing. The one consistent thing, at least I've seen in all the Naschy films, is he always has to do the wrinkle they put into it. And this is kind of in the Universal stuff too. He has to be killed by a silver bullet, but it has to be fired. And I like this wrinkle, fired by a woman who loves him. So every one of these stories, a woman falls in love with him, and then at the end, somehow she shoots him, he scars her, and she dies, and they're in each other's arms like Romeo and Juliet, and that's it. He turns back from a werewolf into, his everyday looking self, but both corpses are on the stage, and then somehow they resurrect him in the next movie. But that's kind of the rule that those films have, is must be killed by someone who loves you, and usually a woman, heteronormative partner.
The plot machinations. Once you create that rule, it calls into being all kinds of things that have to happen. So you have to be very careful.
Yes.
And what can you work out in a film? What can you work out in 90 minutes or 2 hours? Yeah, I love it. Yeah, it's so great. Sorry, Ted, I spoke over top of you, but I'm just having so much fun. And I will stop nattering on. It's this cold. That's why I'm talking.
No, it's fine. It's fine. No, everything you guys are saying is really interesting.
Well, you never know if they're any good.
I'll go back, maybe tossing back a little bit to Brady's comments, because I think he talked about the fact that there are almost kind of like two camps when it comes to horror or whatever, and there's sort of the really kind of hardcore ghosts and werewolves and vampires. And then there's the more subtle kind of supernatural. There we go. And that's really what I've tended toward, although I did say the last episode that I like to reread Dracula every fall. But even that is a much more complex book than what, the movies have kind of given it credit for. So when I think about ghost stories, the ghost stories I tend to like, and in my own writing, I include ghosts, but I do it in my mind, at least, kind of in the Toni Morrison school of ghosts, meaning that, they're ghosts, but they're obviously metaphorical for some sort of trauma or something going on. And again, Toni Morrison does it in a lot of books, most famously, probably Beloved, right. But, also in, the novella Home, we have a zoot-suited ghost that keeps kind of popping up out of nowhere, and a very, very enigmatic, like what that ghost is doing in the scenes and so forth. Song of Solomon has a ghost that's kind of threads through the narrative, and so that tends to be my preference as a reader, but also as a writer, is the more the subtle. So maybe it's a ghost, maybe it's a figment of someone's imagination, maybe it's some sort of just metaphor come to life or something in the story.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, Morrison always comes to mind. The other writer, and I suppose if we have steady viewers, they'll get weary of me talking about Joyce Carol Oates, but she seems so good at these uncertain stories and the ghostly, spectral, demonic figures and gothic stories, gothic novels, epic gothic novels. I love that kind of, as Ted describes, and you see in Ted's work too, that uncertain ground, which I think adds in it can really add to a kind of pressure on the reader, and that sense of not standing on firm ground. A little bit like Grant was saying, part of the pleasure of noir is what's everybody up to. Nobody is as they seem, and I love that feeling of that creeping uncertainty, and there's a kind of dread that can go with it. You certainly see it in Oates and Morrison too. Yeah, so Ted, you're in good company.
And then sometimes like the ghostly thing gets bent a little bit, like I don't know how to explain this, but it's like the trauma, like I was thinking about in the movie Misery, where at the end of the film, I think he's at a restaurant or like a coffee house or something, and he sees the Kathy Bates character. James Caan sees the Kathy Bates character, but it's not Kathy Bates, but he's been so traumatized by what happened. It's just another fan who says, I'm your biggest fan, would you sign this place? And it ends with him kind of creeped out, which means he's going to keep seeing this apparition of this, person that is going to haunt him. So it's kind of a variation on that of his future seems very uncertain to me at the end of that film.
Yeah. It's yeah.
I'm going to use your Joyce Carol Oates reference, Brady, as kind of a segue to something I wanted to talk about too. Yeah, she does do all sorts of wonderful stuff with sort of traditional Gothic stories. But one of my favorite Joyce Carol Oates books, and it's really more of a novella. I teach it in my long story and novella class, along with Toni Morrison's Home, by the way, is her novella Black Water, which is a sort of fictionalized retelling of the Ted Kennedy Chappaquiddick, episode where the young lady, and I'm sorry, the names are not coming to me, the fictional or real,
Mary
but
something, Mary.
Chappaquiddick.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Something Mary Jo Kopechne, I think, something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, that's it, Mary Jo Kopechne. So for anyone of a certain age who doesn't know what I'm talking about, and I find a lot of my graduate students have no knowledge of Chappaquiddick. But anyway, Ted Kennedy was, almost a foregone conclusion to get the nomination for the Democratic, to run for president, and had this horrible thing happen, or did this horrible thing, depending on how you want to say it, where he got drunk and drove off of a bridge with this young woman, Mary Jo Kopechne, who was with him, and the car submerged in the water, and Ted Kennedy managed to get himself out, but she ended up drowning in the water. So Joyce Carol Oates retells that story, and it's so brilliant the way she does it that happens like in the first couple paragraphs of the novella. And so the Ted Kennedy like character gets out of the vehicle and gets to safety. Well, then the young lady, the Mary Jo character, she's trapped in this car, and of course it's at nighttime, so she can't see anything. And that's why it's called Black Water, and the water is seeping in, and it's just getting higher and higher and higher. And then Joyce Carol Oates does this just wonderful narrative thing where we go back and we get some backstory about how they ended up in this position and kind of what's going on with the senator. But then every couple of chapters, maybe every other chapter, we go back to the poor young lady in the car, and she keeps hoping she's going to be rescued, and she thinks she hears somebody maybe trying to rescue her, but meanwhile the water just keeps getting higher and higher and higher. But here's the point that I'm trying to get to here. I think one of the tropes that makes horror is sort of the haunted house thing, which of course in a lot of stories, we can think of like The Haunting of Hill House and so on, where there's literally a haunted house. But I think a lot of writers have used that idea of a sort of foreboding, dangerous space as the setting of the story, and they've expanded it in all kinds of ways. And I think in that novella, Joyce Carol Oates basically turns the interior of this Toyota or something like that into a sort of haunted house, in the sense that it's this gothic space, this dark, dangerous space, and the water keeps rising and rising and rising. Obviously, Dracula's Castle is a classic example of that as well. And one last thing while it's on my mind, and I'll stop talking for a little bit. I teach this course in classic horror and sci-fi by women writers, and it's one of the most popular classes, maybe the most popular class that I teach. And the sci-fi writers who take it are usually a little bit disappointed, because there's not really a lot of what we would think of sci-fi in it, because it covers basically from Mary Shelley to Virginia Woolf. So it kind of ends in the 1930s, and it's a chronologically organized anthology that we use. And sci-fi, as we tend to think of it, didn't really come around until after the atom bomb, like in the 50s and 60s. But anyway, I think there's a overlap though in sci-fi and horror. Oftentimes, I always use the example of the movie Aliens, which I think is like one of the scariest movies. And I went to Aliens on like opening night when we didn't really even know what the movie was about back then. We didn't have all these trailers, and so I remember just being terrified. And I was like a teenager. I was like a little kid, and I think in that, one of the things that makes it so scary is that spaceship it becomes a kind of gothic space. It's dark, there's water dripping, there's like 1,000 corners where the monster may be hiding. And that's one of the master strokes of that film, I think, to take this futuristic space voyage and turn the spaceship into a sort of haunted house, sort of like a Dracula's castle out in the middle of space. So anyway, I'll stop talking and see what you guys have to think about all that.
No, I think I hadn't thought about that until you mentioned it, and then it triggered in my mind. Howard Hawks he produced it. Actually, Chris Nyby directed it. The Thing from Another World, and then the John Carpenter reboot, and how you put it out in like Alaska in this frozen tundra and a military outpost, and there's really you can't get outside the house because you'll freeze to death. So you got to stay inside the compound, but you got this monster running around, and it's a real use of as you said, gothic space, and it's fascinating. It's a great film.
The because my daughter and I are equally strange. One of our family traditions is if we get together over the Christmas holidays, we watch all the Alien films, which seems like standard Christmas fare. It's a Wonderful Life and Alien.
Game over, man.
Yeah, well, and since I'm speaking about my daughter, when I was a young man, or a kid, I used to really like Agatha Christie novels, but I sort of lost track of that reading habit. But my daughter went through a phase, and so we started reading them simultaneously. And I mean, she excels at those isolated environments. The mysteries depend upon a lot of sort of that gothic isolation, and she does it so well. And then to get back to hit back and forth with Ted a little bit, Joyce Carol Oates, I mean, one of the things maybe we need to have a whole show on is just what is the nature of the really prolific writer. But Oates writes a lot of gothic and supernatural novellas, and I think that's right where I think that's her maybe her best spot. I mean, she's a great short story writer and a tireless novelist. But something like Beasts, it's the gothic environment. It's the big creepy house that carries so much of the weight of the story, the horror of the story. Love it. Holding up, yeah. Not only does she write them, but she also has time to edit great collections. Yeah.
Don't forget the criticism and the teaching.
Oh well, yeah, and writing under pen names. It's not enough to be Joyce Carol Oates.
Well, I read an interview with her just very recently, like last year in some lit journal, and she I don't know, I can't quote her directly, but basically that she doesn't understand why people think she's so prolific. She's like, anybody who writes 10 hours a day can put out this kind of material. It's like, yeah, but who among us can write for a solid 10 hours every day, day in and day out, year upon year upon year? I find that even like now that I'm retired, or even in the summertime when I had more time, an hour and a half of creative writing, and I'm pretty much spent for the day. I've recently read a book about the daily habits of creative people, and their creative process. And it wasn't just writers; it was music composers and all kinds of people. But consistently, a lot of people said the same thing, that even if they had all day to do it, they'd write for an hour or two or three, and then they were pretty much done. They couldn't write any more than that. But yeah, no, the Joyce Carol Oates. It's funny because the novella, which has been kind of a it's kind of been disrespected in the last couple decades. I think maybe it's making a little bit of a comeback now, as much as any kind of reading is making a comeback. But I want, as you were talking, Brady, and how wonderful Joyce Carol Oates's Gothic novellas are, I wonder if there's some sort of correlation between the length and the quality that you can kind of achieve, because you mentioned, or maybe you didn't, but Stephen King, came up here, and I feel like his novellas are by far his best writing. I used to be kind of a big Stephen King fan in my college years. It was kind of a guilty pleasure. I was supposed to be reading Chaucer, and I was reading, it instead or something. But I did read Chaucer too, by the way, so don't revoke my degree. But I wonder if there's like an intensity that, and it's easier to maintain or whatever, as opposed to the Stephen King 1,000-page novel, which obviously have been very successful too, but it's much harder to maintain that sort of intensity, the kind that Joyce Carol Oates, for example, is able to achieve in Blackwater. So what about that? Do you think there's a correlation between the length of the work and how much horror or how much tension you're able to get into it?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I think it's that distillation. And I kind of agree with you, Ted. Like I actually I really like Stephen King, and if you like Stephen King, there's a lot to read. So you'll never run out of Stephen King. And I like the big baggy novels, like it. I'm literally reading now because it's October, and I enjoy settling into those worlds. But you can't hurry. But the compression he achieves in his novellas, and I think he's a little erratic. Well, Stephen King, please don't be mad. Yeah, I think he's a little erratic at the short story. I think sometimes he's pretty great. Sometimes I think they seem a little hasty. But the novella, I think it's the compression. It's the reining in, but not that super tight compression of the short story. That just enough breathing space, perhaps, in the novella to keep it tight, keep it focused. Yeah.
Whereas with what you guys, and I haven't read this Joyce Carol Oates novella, Blackwater, but I plan to now after hearing you guys talk about it. But it seems in that, even though it's more of a compressed form, she's expanding time, right? I mean, it's like, it's almost, it's the kind of thing we can do in fiction. We can play with time. We can slow things down. We can, like Bullet in the Brain, by Tobias Wolff, right? I mean, the first half is in the bank and the second half is in his brain. And the split second before he dies, he slows time down. By saying, here's all the things he didn't remember, and here's what he did remember, and then it's the scene on the baseball diamond at the end. So that's, I think, one of the beauties of writing literature is what we can do with time in terms of compression and expanding time. So I'm fascinated to read this Joyce Carol Oates novella.
Well, that you're talking about expansion of time, et cetera, it kind of reminds me of where I've been like kind of living for the last few months, particularly the last week or two. That over the summer I taught this advanced creative writing class, and so they were like undergrad seniors, and then the last few weeks I've been teaching this kind of introductory or orientation course for new MFA students at the other university where I teach at. And so I've been reading a lot of like writing by pretty new or up and coming writers, and a lot of them have aspirations for writing novels, but they're turning in these kind of short stories or chapters of novels, And this is so typical, and I'm sure I was this way too when I first started. They're turning in a 4 or 5 page story chapter thing, but really what it is a summary or a synopsis of a whole novel. I mean, they don't know it's that, but in a sentence or two, we get just tons of information about a character and their backstory and where they're from and blah, 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 blah. Or in a paragraph, we get all kinds of plot details. And really what they need to do is just slow down. And they need to take, that one sentence where we get like 3 or 4 bits of important information about the character and develop each of those bits probably into a separate chapter or separate whatever. And it's that pacing that I think is one of the hardest things for people who are kind of new to writing narrative to get down, is because they want to say too much in too little space. And then ironically, once you do get into the ability to write a whole novel and an agent wants you to send them a summary, it's like, how do I do it? How do I turn a 300-page novel into just a page? So it's kind of, neither side of the fence is very attractive. But I'm seeing some nods out there. Or do you find that too, that pacing is particularly tricky for people who are just starting to write fiction?
Yeah, I really like the story we're going to talk about, but in my classes, I sometimes have students, and I'm trying to figure out how the writer pulled it off, because when I see in a class story page and pages of dialogue, my immediate impulse is, as a writer, is to want to summarize some of that, or to do a kind of compression. I read almost all the Ed McBain 87 Precinct novels, and I love that guy, but he'll go for 3-4 pages of just dialogue. And I'm like, do we really need all of this? Can we, and that for me is where, on the other side, instead of expanding something, I want to contract it. Like, I'm just like, I get the point, let's move on. So anyway, but I was sort of intrigued by the piece we're going to be talking about soon, in terms of the dialogue, and trying to figure out how it's just working, because it's working for me. If that makes sense.
When I'll just chime in, and I think the segue to the story is wholly appropriate. I had the great good fortune as an undergraduate to study with the great Rudy Wiebe, and so I took some classes, Canadian Lit and a great writing class, and we all had to meet with Rudy Wiebe. There's no way I didn't want to go to his office. I was terrified. It was one thing to sit in class with some peers, but it was another thing just to go. But when we sat down, what he talked to me about, we were looking at a story in an anthology that he had edited, and that he was using, models for us, and we talked about pacing our entire meeting, and I remember it all to this day so vividly. Like he wanted to talk about, slowing down,
Mm-hmm.
and finding those details, and not just like stacking them all up, as Ted says, in like 3 sentences. So it was for me, it was a kind of magical moment, one of terror, because I'm sitting in the room.
Brady,
I think. Go ahead, Grant.
No, I was just going to say, like, what's interesting about that, though, is, and I know this because, like, in writing crime stories, some of the markets I'm trying to get in only want like 3,000 words or less,
Right, yeah,
and
get to it.
Yeah, so I'm like, I got to strip everything, and it kind of affected my novel writing a little bit, because it was like, got to move, it's got to move, and it's like, no, I just want to slow down right here. I want to take it, and the novel gives you that pacing, but the markets, it's just 3,500 words. Like I entered a contest recently. It was 2,500 words or less. So I took a 4,000 word story, Death Beat a Moloch, and I got it down to 25. But I'm not sure I'm happy about that. But it was because of the constraints of the contest, and it's the constraints of these journals. I remember one time I sent a story, and it was 2,500 words, and it was 2,550. And they bounced it immediately instead of 50 words. I'm like, come on. That was the MacGuffin. Sorry, we are recording and I'm going to say it, the MacGuffin. So anyway, that's I couldn't
I've
believe.
had that happen too, where I've just been a little bit over, and in my mind, what's a couple hundred words among friends? And yeah, they shoot it right back to you like,
Yeah.
no way, Jose,
Yep.
we said 500 or whatever, and that's what it needs to be. Yeah, let's go ahead and segue into the story because obviously, as much as we enjoy talking, I'm not sure our listeners enjoyed listening to us quite as much as we enjoy talking. So we've been doing like every episode a featured story, and this episode we're doing a story from this journal, which is The Waiting Room, and it just came out this summer. And full disclosure, I have a story in this episode in this issue too, but we're not talking about that one. But it's a really interesting project. It's Nervous Ghost Press, but the journal is beautiful. And one of the things that's so cool about it is there's no words on the cover like the name of the journal. The only thing is just a little Nervous Ghost logo there on the spine. But they're hosting all kinds of Zoom readings, and they're out of Los Angeles, so they're doing live, open mics, and just have all kinds of things going on. It's really, really exciting stuff. But we're going to do a story out of the inaugural issue of The Waiting Room, and specifically, we're talking about The Man Who Could Summon Ocean Whitefish by Michael Lloyd Gray. And I selected this story to share with these guys because I think it is in line, I think, with our kind of horror theme, and we'll kind of talk more about that. But just to give a little bit of a synopsis here, let me just read like the opening paragraph or so. And again, this is Michael Lloyd Gray. He writes, "My cat Wolf turns up dead the day before Christmas, frozen stiff as a board in the yard next door. I see him as I back out the driveway to go check in with the unemployment people. He looks asleep, but his forelegs stick up straight when I roll him on his back. There's frozen blood on his nose and mouth, and they make me think of drops of wine." All right. And so that's how the story begins. And again, obviously, we get, the fact that his beloved cat, has been run over, and he's on his way to the unemployment line. So, so that tells us a little something about where he's at financially. And then as the story develops, we quickly discover that he knows that it's his neighbor, his next door neighbor, Albert, who he doesn't really know very well, even though they've been neighbors for a number of years. Kind of the same with my neighbors around here, frankly. And I've been here 25 years. But he knows it's Albert. And we also find out that his wife has left him. So basically, the only positive thing in his life had been his relationship with Wolf, the cat, and now Wolf is dead. So Ted, the protagonist, we discover a few pages into this. It's a first person narrative, as you can tell. So he has a gun. He has a .45 caliber pistol, which he hasn't really used very much, but he has one. So he goes and gets it, and then he starts stalking Albert. He goes out. Albert, is shoveling snow in his driveway because again it's winter time, and then he ends up kind of taking Albert hostage, and Albert, of course, doesn't understand why it's such a big deal. I mean, he feels bad about running over Wolf, but this whole story kind of unfolds in this kind of manic moment. And I think one of the really strong features of this story is that Ted, the narrator, the protagonist, he doesn't fully understand why he's standing there with a .45 aimed at his neighbor, thinking seriously of pulling the trigger and shooting him to revenge his running over, Wolf the cat, which obviously was an accident. It wasn't something he had planned, and so on. There's just a lot of really funny lines in the story, but there's also a lot of poignant lines. So it's sort of this back and forth in terms of the mood of the piece between comedy, which is obviously kind of a dark comedy, and these really heart-wrenching admissions on the part of the protagonist about how bad his life has kind of turned and so forth. So I'm gonna stop talking there and see what you all think about this particular story.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I couldn't help but, and I know it's not written in a Carver-esque way, but I couldn't help but think of Raymond Carver the whole time I was reading it, in that we've got these sort of inarticulate working people who don't understand what's happening to them. And there's so many of those kind of protagonists in Carver. And this character, you know, doesn't have a job, lost his cat, marriage has crumbled, and he's searching for answers and, you know, can't find them. And so, and then the dialogue reminded me a little bit of Carver, but the minimalist thing isn't there. But this feels like Carver's people without the minimalist vibe. So I love that about it. And then I could kind of date the writer because a lot of his cultural references are ones that I get. You know, Beam Me Up,
Yeah.
Scotty. There's a lot of allusions in the piece that you know, crack me up, but they're ones that I understand. My students, when they do an allusion, I'm like lost. I mean, I don't know what they're talking about, you know. So anyway,
Right.
yeah, I found it, and a little bit of Donald Barthelme. It was like Donald Barthelme, Raymond Carver, and then this guy's originality, you know. But it had that weird absurdist kind of vibe, and Carver's people for me when I was reading it.
Yeah, I love that, Grant. I see exactly what you mean. And I'll agree with Ted too. One of the things I admire most about this story is it's so damn funny,
Yeah,
even as it's so awful. And so it's a good lesson. It's a good lesson for maybe for young writers or any writers to have that kind of tonal palette at play, even as you're on horrifying terrain, to still have the ability to turn a phrase and bring some irony and a laugh to what's going on. Uh, the other, my other very strong reaction is, and of course have this reaction all the time, is what the hell is Ted up to? We're talking about the plan was to talk about horror stories and gothic stories and October and ghost stories. And so when I first started reading this, a cat got run over. You know, unless it's Stephen King and the cat's gonna, you know, be brought back to life with, you know, some patches of fur missing. But as I was thinking about it, this is a horror story of our time. It's the threat of violence, and in particular gun violence, and what's going on in the minds of those who are holding a weapon at us for reasons we cannot understand. This is the horror of our time. This is the nightmare of our time. And so to get this sometime comic character stumbling into something he doesn't even hardly know, as Ted has said, he hardly knows what he's doing or why. And it's nicely layered. There's some nice complexities. Won't speak about the ending and who shows up, and but it's, yeah, in the end it was a very unnerving
yeah.
story. And
They're
so
toast the gun control.
yeah. You know, here I was thinking what we were going to be reading and discussing for the week, you know, was in something more in these expected genres. But yeah, I thought it was so, Ted, not to blow smoke, but yeah, rather expertly chosen for our purposes this week.
Well, I'm glad you feel that way. Yeah, in my mind, this is sort of a Hitchcockian kind of
Yeah.
horror. You know, because it's very believable, unfortunately, that someone, you know, brought to the edge like this. But again, as you say, the narrator is both fully aware, and there are several kind of politically charged, you know, comments in the story about, well, this is what America is, and he talks about Republicans and gun control, and but he also talks about the fact that he has no business owning a 45 caliber pistol. I mean, he's not an expert. He's the kind of person whose cat gets run over and he thinks about killing somebody. He's not the sort of person who ought to own a gun, you know. And so there's all these self revelatory things that happen. But again, there's this tension where you don't know how it's all going to turn out, because it can go very badly. He can shoot Albert. I mean, there becomes a police standoff. Not to give too much away. How is that going to turn out? And so yeah, so in my mind, like you say, it's horror, but of that sort of Hitchcockian version of it, as opposed to maybe the Stephen King brand that we're maybe more used to.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys thought about this, but for me, as I was reading it, I was fearful that there might be a bullet in the chamber. I mean, he takes the clip out of the gun, but he doesn't check the rack. He doesn't check.
Yeah, he doesn't.
the chamber. And I've heard of cases where someone has died, like, accidental shooting, because they forgot there was a bullet in the chamber. So if there was one or not, but I know that was going through my mind the whole time I'm reading it. Like, he takes the clip out, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I mean, this is still a weapon, and it could still be loaded, which I thought was a nice sort of added fear to the story. And I like the callback. I don't want to give stuff away, but there's a callback. There's a sort of through line with a Native American fella that says something to Custer about, we're going to go home by a different road. And then that becomes a line that's picked up later in the story and then at the end of the story. And I think it's handled really well as a kind of spine to the piece, which I thought was excellent.
Well, let me do as I do, and let me kind of parenthetically add a little bit about the author, and then we can go back and maybe touch on a couple of other items in the story if we want to. But again, Michael Lloyd Gray, and his stories have appeared in lots of places. I'll just rattle off a few here: Alligator Juniper, Arkansas Review, I-70 Review, Westchester Review, and again, lots of others. His most recent book came out in 2019 from Red Bat Books, and it's titled, the Armageddon the Armageddon two-step. It's come on two different lines, so it's a little dyslexia there. The Armageddon two-step. He earned an MFA in 1996 from Western Michigan University. So that kind of goes back, Grant, to your idea about the age of the illusions. I'll also mention that his bachelor's is from University of Illinois. So there you go. I've got a couple of University of Illinois alums here, so I wanted to mention that. What's that?
I was going to say, when we started Illinois, Brady and Dan Curley had just died, like rather tragically, I think. I think he got hit by a bus or something while he was.
I think that's right.
Yeah. And I had just read his collection of work because I was curious to know about the creative writing faculty there. And it was a fabulous collection of stories.
Well, and Grant mentions it because this writer mentions that he worked with Daniel Curley when he was at U of I. So that's how that's all come up. And then just the last thing, he's a staff writer for newspapers in Arizona and Illinois, and currently lives in Michigan, where he teaches part-time and plays electric guitar. So that's our author. We normally, or I normally, have chosen for our first three episodes a writer who's maybe a little bit younger and is just kind of up and coming, only has a handful of publications oftentimes and so forth. But A, I liked the story, and B, I don't, why limit our discussion to just those kind of writers? Because obviously we've been writing a really long time, and we're as unknown practically as the greenest writer. So it's just so hard to kind of get your name out there and get people to recognize your writing and so forth. But I don't know, other thoughts on this story as we kind of come near the end of our podcast here.
Well, I know I asked that question earlier. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say, because there was a lot of dialogue in the last third of the piece, and it worked for me. And I'm wondering if you guys have any way to explain that. Like, how do you make that amount of, like, I did not find myself wanting to do compression or narrative summary. Like, it was funny. There was tension. It was working for me, but there was a lot of it down the stretch run of the piece. And I usually, when I look at a story, it's kind of like I see colors, and like, oh, there's exposition. Oh, there's dialogue, there's, it's like I can see the different modes of discourse just on the page. And it just seemed to me there was a lot of direct dialogue in it.
Go ahead, Brady.
My impulse, and I think I see somewhat similar impulse in a writer I admire a great deal. My impulse is to cut dialogue, and so I maybe had a slightly different reaction than Grant's. I thought it could have been a little bit more compressed, but these are idiosyncratic matters.
Yeah.
And so like I like writers like Grant, a bit of dialogue, summary, indirect, free discourse,
Yes.
and then cut back into dialogue. I think there's, and so the like the sort of Elmore Leonard, the kind of pitter patter, I think it works pretty well here. But my impulse too would be to, or my impulse not to, but my impulse would be to compress it and to be even more spare, with the hope of getting even more punch out of smaller bits of dialogue, more telling bits. But yeah, I mean, it's a terrific story and a great read, and
And funny as hell. It's
funny
just
as hell.
like,
Yeah,
yeah, I was cracking up. But it's like we've already said this, but it's political though too. Like it's really, challenging us, and the whole gun culture and the cop going to go get the permit and just, so what the hell's going on here, you morons, you dickheads. I mean, like it takes a turn. It's funny, when I got the story originally, it was a web archive thing, and I only had the first 3 pages, and I thought, oh, what a great ending! I thought it ended with him going inside to have eggnog. So you got all these cops outside, and I'm like, what a precipice ending. We don't know what's going to happen next. It's just so Carver-esque, like where the guy says, "Take my picture," at the end of Viewfinder, right? He's going to throw a rock, and that's the end of the story. And I'm like, oh, this is so Carver-esque. And then suddenly I see you guys talking, and I see this document that's got all these extra pages. I'm like, what the hell? Have I read the wrong story? Anyway, a long story short, I ended up reading the rest of it last night. And I reread the whole thing this morning, and I really like where it goes. I sometimes do a thing where a third of the way through the story, I try to figure out where it's going to go. And this one, I knew some of the moves that were going to happen, but I didn't know all of the moves. So I was pleasantly surprised. And I don't want to give away spoilers, but I was pleasantly surprised by where the plot trajectory ended up in this piece. But that's all I'm going to say, because read the story. It's really good.
Right. And I wanted, I don't want to give too much away too, but I will say that, at a certain point in the story, Albert has to make a decision, and deciding, and what he decides changes Ted's fate, 180 degrees. And
Yeah.
so there's this really dramatic moment because Ted doesn't know what decision Albert's going to make either. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful moment in the story. Beautiful from a narrative standpoint, because the writer is able to sort of bring it to this point so magisterially. And I always kind of call those moments kind of Huck Finn moments, in Huck Finn, when Huck has to decide, does he turn the escaped slave Jim in, or does he help him to escape? And so he's got to make this moral decision. And oftentimes in fiction, we come to that point, and we have that kind of point, in this story. And like I said, I think the writer brings us there. About dialogue, I would just say I think it's just very well done. And one of the things that I really like about it is because for most of the story, it's just the two guys talking, to Albert and Ted. And so the writer just kind of keeps ping-ponging back and forth between them with no he said, he
Right.
asked. That's one of the things, again, in student writers, I really try to discourage them putting tags in unnecessarily. Obviously, if you've got 3 or 4 or 5 people in a scene, you've got to help the reader usually kind of understand who's saying what. But we get little bits here and there to kind of give us some sense of the action of what's going on, physically as these scenes are going on. But otherwise, it's just this snappy repartee. It's like an Alan Sorkin, show or something. That obviously was one of kind of the strengths of like the West Wing and those kind of Alan Sorkin shows, is that really fast-paced, witty dialogue. And I think this writer really has that down pat.
Well, that was the other thing I was going to say too. I like how this writer, like in a comic way, this is what absurdist writers are good at doing. There's a way in which it borrows a lot of tropes from melodrama, and I mean melodrama in a positive way. You guys know this. I love melodrama. But it borrows from melodrama in Hollywood films and TV shows.
Yes.
I mean, the cop cars showing up, the phone call made, the neighbor lady looking through the window, and then obviously, like all that stuff is like. But then the writer is able to take that sort of scaffolding of popular culture texts and go somewhere fresh and new with it, defamiliarize the typical genre stuff. So I love how he leans into the genre but then takes it somewhere else. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So we're probably testing or trying the patience of our audience. So let me just come back and just always ask you guys for some final thoughts before I hit the stop record button. Brady, do you have any kind of final words of wisdom for us here?
Oh, well, words of wisdom. No, neither at the beginning, the middle, nor the end, words of wisdom. But yeah, part of the impulse behind, I think, some of the focus of today's conversation is I want to go on record. Halloween is my favorite holiday. It's my favorite time of year, and so I'm just delighted, and I hope we haven't nattered on and anesthetized any folks kind enough to give us an ear or watch the podcast. So delighted to hang out and talk a little bit about the Gothic and ghost stories and cats getting run over.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. That was well said, Brady. But for full disclosure purposes, Christmas is my favorite time of year, and I'm going to admit it. I kind of like Hallmark movies. I'm sorry, I know all you people out there. There goes my cred. But I want
Grand.
I know.
What?
I know. I just full disclosure, transparency, baby. So, I have friends that do exactly that, Bray. They give me that hockey player head shake when they go to the penalty box. Like, how can you like that stuff? Anyway, yeah.
Well, you need to invent a new genre, Grant, the Hallmark werewolf movie. Kind of bring both those things
That would
together.
be awesome. I love werewolves.
I know. All right. So, well, thank you guys. I really enjoyed it as always. I'll hit the stop record button here, and I appreciate anyone out there who has listened to us or watched us. And we'll be back next month, hopefully.